It's time for what America really needs. Faith, family, fitness, freedom. From the home of Pikes Peak, here are your hosts Jason Lupo and Aaron Lujan.
Welcome, friends and family. This is Faith, Family, Fitness, and Freedom on the great 100.7 FM The Word. I am your host today, Aaron Lujan, with my today co-host, normally the host, Jason Lupo, all the way out in North Carolina, maybe even South Carolina. Good afternoon, Jason.
Hey, how are you doing? It's great. It's hot and humid out here in the Carolinas.
You're in the
Still
Carolinas.
North Carolina. Traveling to South Carolina for a powerlifting meet. Bench Nationals out here with two of my lifters. So it's going to be an exciting couple days.
I would love it if your athletes wore t-shirts that says, "Do you even lift, bro?" That would just make me happy. I don't know if it'd make anyone else happy.
I mean, we could make this happen.
Let's do it.
I like the shirts that say Jesus is the ultimate deadlifter. That's the one I want.
That would be very appropriate considering your brand. It'd be very on brand for you, Jason. Well, we're not here to talk about powerlifting, although you should get in the gym if you're not in the gym right now. But we are here to talk about a very interesting story from Missouri. The Attorney General, Andrew Bailey from the state of Missouri, is filing a federal lawsuit against Joe Biden's what he's calling illegal rule that's forcing healthcare providers to perform harmful gender transitions. This is a federal lawsuit in coordination with the state of Utah, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Idaho, Arkansas, and the the American College of Pediatricians. And this, the plaintiff cited in the lawsuit is Javier Becerra, the official Secretary of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, and his United States Department of Health and Human Services Department. Jason, why is this top of mind for you, and what are your initial thoughts in this news break?
Well, I think this is a pretty important topic, and it's a pretty important topic for a wide variety of reasons. And we saw in this last go-around in the Colorado legislature that they created an independent commission to identify the doctors that were willing to perform gender-affirming care on minors in the state of Colorado. And if you recall back to that conversation when I had it, and this was, 5-6 months ago, I said, I think we're going to get to a point where they're going to use this in order to basically try to strip doctors' licenses away if they're not willing to perform this type of care. And now we see it. It's happening at a national stage. Biden's pushing for it. He's pushing for pediatricians to be forced to provide this gender-affirming care. And so it brings up a very interesting conversation about right of conscience. It also brings out a interesting conversation about the Hippocratic Oath. And just a lot of different, we can spin this in about 25 different ways. And so I look forward to this conversation. I
do too. And the other thing I want to touch on when we come back from our break is this idea of how far we've come or how far we've gone. How far the line has been pushed in this cultural battle to this gender ideology experiment that we're engaged in, apparently. So when we come back, we're going to get into this topic of the lawsuit of doctors being forced to perform, quote, gender transition surgeries when we return on Faith, Family, Fitness, Freedom on 100.7 FM The Word.
Full Armor Sports Teams has a new facility for after-school youth programs. It's located at 2380 Montebello near North Academy and Union with 2 pools for swim lessons and swim teams, a weight room for powerlifting, conditioning, and more. Full Armor Sports Teams is a Christ-centered and family-oriented organization bringing the youth of Colorado Springs together. For more info on after-school and homeschool programs, go to fullarmorsportsteams.com or call 719-629-SWIM.
Welcome back to Faith, Family, Fitness, and Freedom. You are listening to 100.7 FM The Word. I am your host today, Aaron Lujan, with Jason Lupo in North Carolina. We are discussing this fascinating news break out of the state of Missouri. The Attorney General, along with a number of other states, is suing Joe Biden's Secretary of Health and Human Services over the illegal rule forcing healthcare providers to perform harmful gender transitions. Jason was touching on his thoughts on how this brings up a number of issues. The issue that it brings up to me sort of at 30,000 feet viewpoint is how far we've gone, how far we've wandered off the trail, so to speak, in this cultural battle where we're now discussing the idea of whether or not should we, but should we force healthcare providers to perform what I call mutilation. In any time that you take God's design and you essentially mutilate it, and you do it on minors, that is evil par excellence, in my opinion. And the fact that we're now here should be a huge siren. It should be an alarm clock. It should be something that should wake us all up and say, we need to reevaluate where we are as a culture, because the fact that we're even having this conversation is unacceptable in a decent society. And I know that Jason's going to touch on a lot of these other issues, but I just wanted to get that out of the way, because if we continue to have these conversations where this is normalized, we've almost conceded some of our capital to the enemy when we normalize these conversations as if we're discussing immigration. This isn't a conversation about the border or about fiscal policy. This is a conversation about surgically mutilating children. And I just want to be very clear about this. But I digress. So Jason, I know you want to discuss other aspects of this issue.
Well, I like this 30,000 foot picture for a second, because we are so much further down the road in this woke extravaganza, this gender ideology nonsense, that I think the vast majority of the public doesn't even know where we're at. I mean, we are at the point where, yes, we're having a conversation about doctors essentially being forced to provide gender-affirming care, whether that be puberty blockers or hormone treatments or actually surgeries themselves. But we also see parents being stripped of their children for parents that do not conform with their child's identity and that do not treat them as if they were the opposite gender. And so we've taken away parental rights.
Yeah.
In the state of Colorado and in most states, most liberal states at least, if a child goes to school and decides that they want to change their gender, the parents aren't even notified. And so right now there's a petition going around in the state of Colorado to provide awareness to parents within 48 hours if their child shows gender incongruence, which is the new terminology that I think the right is using to say, kids that don't identify with the gender that they're born in. We keep using different terminology, and I think it's just kind of crazy. But anyways, that's the 30,000 foot picture. We are so far down this road, and I think people still think this is new, and it's not new, because we have parents being stripped of their children, being stripped of their parental rights. Those children are going into the foster care system. They're going into social services because the parents won't abide by these wild ideologies. And now we're going to start seeing it with doctors. And now we have a group of people in Republican states that are actually fighting back. And that's what's big about this, and what's big about the Attorney General in the state of Missouri, is that we finally have a lawsuit. We finally have somebody fighting back.
Jason, I want to ask you a question on that issue of parental consent, because I want to understand the logic, or at least the argument, that the enemy, let's call it the enemy at this point, is making children feel they're incongruent, they're in the wrong body. So they are making the decision as a, call it 16-year-old, as a minor, for example, to get quote unquote gender affirming surgery, what sane people call gender mutilation, horror surgery. And then if the parents don't have a right to, over their minor child, and I guess, what is the argument here? That because it's the worldview of the state or the federal government that this is normal and natural, that this is no longer the domain within parental rights or parental consent? Can you help me understand this?
Well, I mean, we first have to start with the fact that we took what we believed was a states' rights issue that has now become, Biden has made it a federal issue. He's taken the ability of the states to make some of these calls away from the state back to the federal government, which if you go back in time to just a couple of years ago when Roe versus Wade was overturned, and they pushed it back on the states, they said this is a states' rights issue. And all of this nonsense that's going on with Title IX, with men playing in women's sports, with the doctors having to provide gender-affirming care, with parents having to acknowledge their child's gender. All of this stuff the federal government, the Biden administration has taken on. They've taken it away from the states, and eventually these cases are going to find themselves back in the Supreme Court, and they're going to be tossed back to the states.
What's the crux of the
argument? It's going to be tossed all together.
Right. So right now they're asserting this is a federal issue, not a state issue, correct?
But Biden has made it that way.
Biden is forcing the hand of it being a federal issue. What's the crux?
And a lot of it goes back to Title IX, right? A lot of this goes back to this Title IX argument of whether or not Title IX should supposedly protect kids that are gender incongruent in public spaces and in education when it comes to locker room use, sports, and I guess medical treatment in that respect.
What's the crux of the argument for there to not necessarily need to be parental consent over these decisions?
Well, it's really simple. When you have a child that is free to make decisions based on their whim, then they're going to make decisions that don't necessarily make sense or are not in the best interest of the child. And we have perverted teachers and perverted school administrators that are allowing this to take place, that are allowing kids to pretend that they're dogs and puppies and unicorns and the opposite gender and all this other crap. And so the perverted minds of these adults are brainwashing these children. And the only way that it's going to be allowed is if you keep parents out of the room. The minute the parents understand what's going on, there's going to be a stop. There's going to be some wild school board meetings like we saw during the COVID pandemic. These administrators, these schools do not want parents involved in the education process because what they're doing is they're brainwashing these children with their own perverse thoughts and ideas and ideologies.
But isn't the legal precedent of being a minor that they cannot make decisions independently, that a parent must make these types of decisions for them? I don't understand why this is not just completely thrown out.
We have a problem in this country for a long time of determining what age of consent is. We have a problem in this country determining what signifies an adult. And then we have, and we'll go even further because we have research that shows that now we have this new developmental stage called emerging adulthood. This is research that came out 10 years ago that basically says that, you know, until a kid is 25, they're in this emerging adulthood stage and they still can't really make decisions for themselves.
Ben Shapiro just recently said we don't graduate adults until they're in their 40s.
Which is probably, you know, there's probably a large amount of that's highly true. But we have this situation where you can get a driver's license at 16. In some states, you can get a tattoo at 14. You can get a tattoo at 16 in some states without parental consent. Now you're altering your body for forever. But you can't drink until you're 21 because you don't have the mental capacity to somehow make that decision. And now, as of the Trump administration, you can't smoke until you're 21 because you don't have the mental capacity to make that decision. But you can still have the mental capacity to make the decision to join the military. And on top of that, somehow you're still responsible for the crimes that you commit being charged as an adult at the age of 18. So we can't even decide what an adult is and when somebody can make can consent to anything in this country, what the age is of consent. And we haven't even gotten in the age of consent of interactions between different age groups and those of relational status.
It's just news breaking to me that we haven't settled the age of consent within the legal realm. I thought that was well established, at least in the United States. 18 and 21 were those markers, and everything sort of fell underneath that, and it was a very black and white issue. I did not know that legally we are having trouble establishing age of consent laws in this country. That's fascinating.
So, let's go back to this. And I testified on the Parents' Bill of Rights up in the state capitol when the Parents' Bill of Rights came up in committee, and I basically disclosed the fact that in the state of Colorado, youth can get the hepatitis B, HPV, and there's one other vaccine without parental consent. And the Democrats who passed this bill not more than like 2 years ago didn't even realize that youth could get vaccines without parental consent. They didn't even, they essentially called me a liar until Brandy Bradley came on and said, "Hey, Jason, can you quote where that came from?" And I laid it out in front of him. I said, here's the House bill that passed. I mean, these are people that passed these bills and don't even remember that they passed a bill saying that they can, that children can get vaccines without parental consent. There was a doctor that was testifying that didn't understand that either. And so, either they don't want to admit that they passed it because they know that it's wrong, or they just forgot that they passed it. But either way, we are allowing children to make adult decisions, sometimes at the age of 13 and 14. And now we're talking about 10, 11, and 12 years old making adult decisions about their bodies. And they want the parents out of it.
It's fascinating. And with 7 minutes left, I want to touch on this good conscience issue, because in the lawsuit, it's essentially pushing back against the federal government coercing, using their force and their power to impose themselves to force a profession, in this case doctors, to conduct something, whether it goes against or does not go against their conscience. And it brings up this idea of the Hippocratic Oath. I'm trying to understand in the context of the law, Jason, how does this good conscience principle play out? Because when I read the Hippocratic Oath, it says, "I shall work with my profession to improve the quality of medical care and to improve the public health, but I shall not let any lesser public or professional consideration interfere with my primary commitment to provide the best and most appropriate care available to each of my patients." So how does that square up in the legal battle?
Well, so we actually have two separate issues here, right? When you think about the oath, it's do no harm, right? So we can go down this trail of, if we are providing gender-affirming care to a 10-year-old who's still going through the developmental psychology stages and might not actually believe that they're the opposite gender, and it might just be part of the developmental process, and we decide to alter their entire bodies to where they might not be able to have kids later in life, are we doing no harm? And the flip side of that is that the counter argument, well, the left and the liberal woke agenda is, well, if you don't provide this care, then you're doing harm because you're going to cause them mental distress. I don't buy it, and we can have this debate. That's a separate debate. What this boils down to, what this whole argument boils down to, is what is known as right of conscience. And so there's long held precedent that human beings, American citizens, can retain our right of conscience. And where this becomes a big issue and where we've seen it lately is... Sorry,
is that a First Amendment right?
So it's kind of ingrained throughout the Constitution, ingrained in really the Declaration of Independence. It's a right that we inherently have. And that's been basically seen as a right that we can withhold. And so basically what it says is, you can't force me to do something that's against my conscience, that's against my strong held beliefs. You can't force me to do something that goes against what I believe is morally right or wrong. And so that's where we see this issue take place. So we saw this take place with some of this assisted suicide stuff, right? Physician-assisted suicide. Can doctors basically say, no, I'm not going to be a part of that? We've seen it take place back with Obamacare and the Catholic organizations not wanting to pay for birth control treatment as part of medical insurance. And we're seeing it with abortion, right? Is our gynecologists, our medical professionals going to be forced to provide abortions? That's going to come up here very soon. And now we're seeing it with pediatricians, and we're seeing it with doctors that work with youth. Can they force a doctor to buy into this gender ideology theory and either prescribe hormone blockers or prescribe opposite gender hormone therapy to try to enhance certain physical features of a child during their adolescence? And it's going to come to the extreme where now we're talking about actual, gender transition surgery, and we're talking about actually altering a child's body completely. And that's going to happen. And we've seen it happen to a certain degree. It hasn't gotten too extreme, but we do know of females who want to identify as male, and doctors are actually performing mastectomies on these girls at like 14, 15 years old, and it's heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking because what happens if in 3-4 years that girl changes her mind and that she realizes that she made a giant mistake? And at what point have we gone too far where now these young men and women can no longer conceive children when they come into adulthood and decide that they were just being childish or just had a warped sense of reality as a child, and we've taken that away from them?
I think all serious, well-meaning people at a very innate level understand the evil that's breathing down our neck. There's a cornucopia of arguments against this. It's like, pick one, pick anyone. I got arguments against this for days. I think what we're witnessing and what we're experiencing in this time in history is just pure unadulterated evil, making a concerted effort and assault without restraint on people of good conscience and saying, what's going to be your hand? What move are you going to make? I mean, I use this analogy with my wife all the time, but I always bring this back to like adolescent street fights. This is kind of the part in the fight where the punch has been swung. You got hit. You're now in a fight, bro. So now you got to make a decision. Are you going to fight or are you going to run away? If you are going to fight, what's going to be your move? Is it going to be a left hook, a right hook? Or are you taking him to the ground? This is where we're at, Jason, because I mean, we could talk about, Hippocratic oath. We could talk about, good conscience. We could talk about, the fact that this is obviously wrong, age of consent. There's so many different things we could talk about. It's wrong on so many different levels. This is really just, I think, a test for people to make a decision. What are you going to do in a time of crisis? What kind of people are we going to be when evil's at our doorstep? And forgive me if I'm over dramatizing this, but I get upset when the federal government is going to force people who used to be in a very noble profession to essentially mutilate children and pervert God's design in some sort of satanic sacrifice or some sort of public display of satanic ritual. I mean, that's really what we're dealing with, and it blows my mind. It absolutely does.
Yeah, I think we're going to continue to see this battle in the medical field, and it's not going to end here, right? The medical field is taking such leaps and bounds right now from a scientific perspective that medical professionals are always going to be having to answer the question for themselves whether something is right or wrong, right? Is it right or wrong that we're going to start, basically trying to create body parts from stem cells? And doctors are going to have to ask the question whether or not they're okay with that, whether or not they're playing God. I think that the medical profession is going to continue to see these drastic battles of conscience. Now, this one hits really home for me. It hits really home for parents because we're seeing it happen in our schools. I'm seeing it happen with the kids that I work with. I'm seeing it happen in our community. But it's not just going to end here. And some of these things are going to set precedents that are going to carry through for a very long time. And now we're going to start seeing doctors that are potentially going to be forced to provide end of life drugs for, critically ill patients that want to take their own lives. And some doctors are going to be against it and some doctors are going to be for it. But are we going to force the doctors that don't agree to provide that type of care? That's where it gets interesting.
This is the debate moving forward, and I think the debate that's going to be created from this debate is whether or not we're going to continue to participate with the federal government and state governments and these institutions, because people of good conscience eventually, I think, are going to come to a point where it's going to be criminal to be a Christian. We're going to have to participate in civil disobedience in good conscience, because this is going to be one of those classic, do we obey man or do we obey God? And this is how a country devolves, and this is how empires end, is we have these situations where we cannot agree within the framework of the pre-existing institution or state, in this case, Missouri, and good doctors of good conscience are not going to perform this, and they're going to be sued, and they're going to lose their licenses. And then eventually we're going to have these parallel economies, if you will. We're going to have parallel healthcare providers, and, you know, we're going to have state providers, and the future is up for grabs. Jason, as we wind things down, 30 seconds, close us out.
Yeah, I think it's really important that parents force themselves into the classroom, force themselves into understanding what is going on in their child's school. We saw time and time again during the COVID pandemic that parents finally had the classroom inside their home with Zoom, and they saw what was going on, and they were infuriated. And they showed up to meetings. They showed up to school board meetings. They brought a sense of power and strength, and they were upset. And we need to keep that going if we're going to change what's going on in our schools.
This was Faith, Family, Fitness, and Freedom on 100.7 FM, The Word. We are available on the interwebs, on all the major podcast players. Please join us every Saturday at 9 a.m. on 100.7 FM, The Word.